Thank you for listening to WJ Talk, the Waterways Journal place for conversations that move the marine and waterways industry forward. The sponsor of this month's interviews is Laborde Products. Laborde Products stands at the forefront of marine engine distribution, committed to delivering excellence as your trusted partner in marine propulsion, featuring top brands like Mitsubishi, Steyr Motors, Yanmar, and Scania Marine. Once again, thanks for listening.
My name is Zach Metcalf. I'm the associate publisher and editor of the Waterways Journal. I'm excited to have another episode of WJ Talk here. This is a special one. 3 retired industry professionals with us with decades of experience in industry, including employment with federal barge lines. So we're excited to get to know you a little bit about your history in the industry. Joining us today is Mayfield, Wendell Macejak, and Steve Rauch. So if you guys could kind of start off with, how you got your start in the industry initially. If Mark, you wanted to start off, and then we'll go to Wendell and Steve.
Well, we were conversing a little bit before we went online. Mine's a little different, but I'll as I said, I thought my future was going to be with J.C. Penney. That didn't quite work out. And I returned. I went from St. Louis to Century to Chicago, quit J.C. Penney. As I mentioned to you before, I got tired of working all the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays and long hours at the J.C. Penney. I said, I don't want to work weekends and holidays anymore. So I went back to St. Louis, and it was the Vietnam era. And I was, unfortunately had gotten my 1A draft a few years before. And so I joined the Marine Corps Reserves. And there, Steve, is where I met Ron Moore, who was a Marine Corps reservist. And at one of our weekend meetings, he brought in a Waterways Journal and pointed out to me the Federal Barge Lines ad for a dispatcher. Well, thanks for the prop, Steve.
Anytime.
And
appreciate that.
And Zach, what had happened at Federal, and Wendell wanted, but Steve jumped in with me. They had lost two important people at Federal Barge Line. One was Robert Miller, who was a barge dispatcher and went on with his sons to become Robert Miller and Associates. And the other was Noble Parsonage, who left Federal St. Louis ship, whatever you want to call it. And we all know what he ended up doing with his family at Memco. So they had some vacancies there. They hired me in a couple of days, and it took off from there. So Steve, you were next in line.
Okay.
After me.
Okay. Well, my dad was in the barge business up in the Chicagoland area with Twin City Barge and Towing Company and another company. And make a long story short, right out of high school, well, the first thing I did, 2 days out of high school, he shipped me out on a Great Lakes freighter. I graduated from high school on a Wednesday night, and by noon Friday, I was gone. And I thought, what in the heck did I do here? But I worked for 1 week on a Great Lakes freighter, made one trip there, and came back and worked on the river as a deckhand up in the Chicagoland area for Twin City Barge and Towing. And then I did it the summer of 1969 out of high school, and then went to college for a few years. And I was working in a furniture store 3 years later, part-time, when my dad found out about an opening with Federal Barge Line in Chicago for a dispatcher. And since I had worked on the rivers up there, I knew the river and I knew all the docks, and I interviewed for the job and got it. And I worked 2 years for Federal in Chicago as their dispatcher, and then they transferred me down to St. Louis in 1974, and I worked for 5 years there for Federal in St. Louis, and then kind of started on an odyssey from there. I went to work for ConAgra, and ConAgra bought PV and worked there for a while, and then went to work for Merchants Transportation and for 9 years, then Valley Line. And then I was out of the business for about 3 years, got back into it in 1995 with Midwest Marine. Ron Moore, Mark, who you mentioned, was a president of Midwest Marine. Was there for 3 years, and then I was hired by Memco in 1998. And the man who actually gave me the call is on this call here with us right now, Wendell Macejak.
Wow.
The president of Memco, Chris Parsonage, had Wendell call me and offer me the job. And that meant a lot to me that it was Wendell who did it because of our history together. And I was with Mimco and the AP for 18 years, mostly in dispatching, but the last 8 years was full-time sales, which I thoroughly enjoyed. So I've been, like a lot of us, been around with many different companies, many different locations, and in the business, the river business, for 41 years. And I can honestly say I loved every minute of it.
That's great. That's great. And how about you, Wendell?
Well, I grew up in the Chicago area, and about the only thing I knew about boats and barges, occasionally I'd see one on the Cal Sag on the South Branch go under a bridge when I was going over in a car. So I really didn't know anything about the barge business. But the tie, myself and Steve, we've kind of got this little tie. Steve was leaving Chicago with Federal to go to St. Louis to the home office. And a fellow that lived across the street from me, who operated Sims Trucking and Transport in their terminal up there in Chicago, heard about this opening. He saw me one day walking down the street. I just got out of high school, and he asked me, he said, what do you plan on doing? I said, well, I'm not sure. I said, they've ended the draft, so I'm not sure now if I want to enlist or what I'm going to continue with education or whatever. And he said, why don't you give this guy, Tom Maloney, a call? He's got an opening for a dispatcher for a barge line. And he said, go talk to him. He said, I'll call Tom and put in a good word for you. I said, oh, okay, fine. So with Steve leaving to go to St. Louis, I was hired as a dispatcher there in Chicago to take over Steve's old position. So that's kind of how my introduction came to the barge business. And like Steve, after 5 years in 1979, I was transferred down to St. Louis with Federal Barge and worked there until they closed the doors after the sale.
His feet might have been interrupted. That's okay. Might pop.
Okay. Yeah, that's how I got into the business there at Federal Barge Lines. And like I say, I had it in the back of my mind I was going to be there until the day I retired, until the company was sold to Ohio River Company. Yeah. And I didn't go to work with them. I stayed here in St. Louis and then ended up with Valley Line and other Memco and beyond. So that was my start.
I had to tell this story. When I was leaving Chicago to come to St. Louis, when Wendell came into our Chicago office to interview for the job, he walks in the office with his buddy, his friend. And I thought, what did he bring his agent with him or something? So we sat there interviewing Wendell with his best friend sitting there too. So
sounds like Ben Affleck and Matt Damon.
Yeah, that's right. You remember that, Wendell?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no. When my friend found out I was going downtown to do this interview, he said, hey, do you mind if I tag along? I want to go do some things down there. And I said, no, that's fine. And, our thought was, hey, we're going into this big office building and, there's going to be a big reception room. He can just sit there while I go in and interview with whoever I'm going to interview with. So it turns out we open the door and there's just two offices in a little small reception area. So Tom Maloney, who was doing the interview, he said, tell your friend, come on in here too. You can sit in here. And I said, oh, okay. And I yelled, hey, Chuck, come on in. So it was a strange interview process.
Yeah, I thought maybe your friend was going to help negotiate for you or something.
Well, Steve, we have to say too, now Tom Maloney came from Chicago to St. Louis when? Do you recall?
About 1978,
Yeah, VP
of
sales.
It was before that, wasn't it, Wendell? Like 70.
Yeah, it was probably late 76, early 77.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And that's when Black Jack Flow took over the Chicago office, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
But Zach, those are names that we remember, and there's very few people out there that would remember those names. But
I'm sure
it was an interesting interesting group of people. It really was. That's why I wish Jeff Kendall was on the line, because he was in New Orleans dealing with Federal Barge when we had the Titans of the River. And I was going to bring that up. I mean, we had that United States in America at 9,000 horsepower. There wasn't anything like them on the inland waterways. And I still remember buying 100 or 120,000 gallons of fuel at a time at Baton Rouge. And guys, if I'm wrong, I think we might have paid 25 cents a gallon at Baton Rouge for fuel on the United States of the America. And both of those, one of them has been scrapped, and the other one is a fleet boat, I think at Cairo.
Yeah, for ACBL. I think it's called the Al Paneer now, or it was anyway. I've been out of it for 10 years, so it was at Cairo for ACBL. It was a fleet boat. They kept their rigging on there and did crew changes and what have you. But
I worked with Al Paneer when I was at ACBL.
Was it? Okay. Yeah, those were the American and the States, as we call it, the United States. They were called the Titans of the Waterways back then. And they were 9,000. But then people started coming out with their 10,000 and 10,500 horsepowers, including Federal. You know, we had our J.S. McDermott and the Dick Connerly. And it seemed like every company was coming out with a 10.5 back in the day.
Yeah. Well, did Valley Line go to 12,000, 11,000 or 12,000? I was saying, was it the W.J. Barter? Was that the 12,000?
No, they were, I think they may have been repowered. I think the Miss KD was, which was the old Flowers boat that they bought when they merged with Valley Line. But they were 10.5s when I first got over there at Valley Line.
And Zach, something we've talked among ourselves, and again, I wish Jeff was here, but what we've seen so much of is we really had a good time at Federal Barge Line. And there's one gentleman in particular whose name I have to say, and that was Robert A. Kyle. No one else will remember him except people from Federal Barge. But he was president of United Barge Line and then became president of Federal Barge Line, which were both pot industry barge lines. But one was a non-union barge line, and the other was we dealt with union barge lines in those days, in those 70s.
And Bob Kyle,
there's a whole bunch of stories about that.
But, and Bob Kyle is the one that decided to bring us from Chicago to St. Louis at the time.
No.
So
I'll never forget. As I said, I quit JCPenney because I didn't want to work weekends and holidays anymore. Started at Federal Barge, and guess who got the first Christmas? Who got the next Christmas at Federal Barge?
Yeah,
I got the next Christmas, but I got to say, Bob had a great feeling for that because he sent a card with a bouquet of flowers to my wife and said, "We appreciate Mark working at Christmas holidays."
And of course, we lost Bob Kyle to, was it leukemia? I think
leukemia.
And he was only like 42 years old or so.
42 years old.
I'll never forget that. What a horrible experience that was. And I think about this often. I go around the room at Federal. I think about all the people that, our bosses. They're all gone now. It's depressing.
But the hallmark of the late 70s and especially the 80s was the consolidation. Federal became Ohio River Company, became eventually Ingram, and the number of companies that just went out of business because St. Louis in the 70s and early 80s was just a fantastic place for barge companies and individuals. There was a barge line softball league. There was a barge line bowling league. I still remember a lot of those times on the hill after the softball games with a beer and a little bit of pasta. But the Propeller Club in St. Louis, we had Christmas parties that were just unbelievable.
I did a little head count this morning. I made a little list this morning. I'm not going to read all the companies, but I came up with 19 companies that when we first came to St. Louis in 1974, there were 19 barge companies located in the St. Louis area, mostly St. Louis, one up in Alton, which was PV Company. 19, and they're all gone now, except Bungie. I'm not sure about them. They had a deal with SCF, but SCF got acquired by Ingram, so I'm not sure what that did with Bungie Barge Line. But there were 19 companies that I came up with St. Louis was an absolute mecca for barge line headquarters back in, like you said, Mark, mid to late 70s and early 80s. It just was. It was the place to be if you want to be in the barge business.
Now, do you think I was going to ask you guys, what had the greatest impact on your career? Do you think it was the consolidations and mergers along the way after Federal?
For me personally, it was, and probably from Mark and Wendell too. I mean, I've lost jobs because of mergers and acquisitions, and I was out of the river business for almost 3 years because of mergers and acquisitions, and so that's definitely the single biggest impact, Zach, for me personally on my career was the layoffs for mergers and acquisitions, no question.
But Steve, I want to make, because I had your note here, you were with Farmline Industries in those 3 years, so you may not have been doing barging, but you were affiliated with the Waterways.
I worked for Farmland for about 2 years, and Farmland had been a customer of ours when I was with the barge companies, so that's kind of how I got that job. But the whole time I was out of it, out of the river business, I wanted to get back in very badly. And, as only fate would have it, I got to go to work for Midwest Marine, Ron Moore and Scott Putman. I interviewed with them, and I knew those guys. Well, I didn't know Ron well. I knew Scott Putman pretty well, one of the owners of Midwest Marine. He interviewed with them, and that got me back into the river business after almost 3 years. And I felt like I had been reborn again. It was like night and day for me.
Well, Steve, another thing, I was with Scott Putnam when I went to SCNO. So,
yeah, I know.
People just that's just the way it was.
Now,
there was
Scott Putman related to Jeremy Putman?
I don't
know.
I don't know. I don't think so. I've never heard that first name.
It's Riverview Tug Service, and they've got a boat store as well.
Go ahead, Wendell. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, I think that's, we're kind of touched on it here about the industry, how it consolidated starting in the early 80s. You had, in the country as a whole, you had this deregulation fever for all the modes of transportation, the airlines, the trucking, the barge lines, the rail lines. And what that did is it took the level playing field away, and it was every man for himself at that point.
Yeah.
The smaller companies couldn't survive. They could when it was regulated and they were moving cargo from New Orleans to Chicago at $15 a ton, because that's the rate everybody could charge. That's what was in the ICC regulation book. Once they deregulated the industry, you had people now were going $6 a ton from New Orleans to Chicago.
Salt.
The big guys
from
could maybe
New Orleans
afford to
to Chicago was $3.25 a ton.
Yeah. So I mean, the big guys could absorb some of that, where the little guys couldn't, and so all of a sudden you had the big guys started gobbling up the smaller ones, and that kicked off when I thought deregulation changed the industry tremendously, because then what it also did is, as Steve mentioned, there were so many companies here. I mean, it was every month you'd hear about somebody leaving this company, going to that company, and so now there was an opening there, so people would move there, and it was like musical chairs. Once deregulation hit and companies started getting bought out, it changed. There wasn't this plethora of jobs. There wasn't all this job hopping, and it changed the industry maybe for the better. I don't know. That's more of a political, and I guess, was that the right move or not? But that's what happened.
I'm glad you brought that up, Wendell. That's a huge factor is the deregulation in the late 1970s. It used to be that all your major barge lines, you had to have common carrier rights. Do you remember those days? You had to file with the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Waterways Freight Bureau, and rates. There were certain rates, not so much on bulk like grain or cement and stuff like that, but on regulated products like steel products. Anything you could count was considered regulated and was subject to a tariff that was where the rates were already set by the Interstate Commerce Commission. And when that went away in the late 70s, everything became deregulated. And like I said, well, it was every man for himself, every company for themselves. And, the rates just kind of plunged. And I remember it really hit the industry hard, like in 1980 and 81. There were some companies that really struggled because they didn't have the staying power to hang in there with it. So
well, I have to supplement, Steve. Also, 1980, Zach, was the Russian grain embargo by the then administration, and that was a killer. Imagine grain embargo. And there was one other thing, I don't remember the year now, but we also ran into a coal issue there where we had, I'm trying to remember now, but there was a coal embargo at one point in the 80s where we had ships lined up on East Coast, West Coast, New Orleans, couldn't load and so forth. But those double whammies with the deregulation sunk a bunch of people. As a matter of fact, Federal Barge Line had a full-time employee that did nothing but handle our regulated issues that we came up with. I can't pick up the name, Steve. Who was that?
Howard Miller.
Howard Miller.
Yeah.
Yeah, you had to have it. Each company had to have their own basically expert on the Interstate Commerce Commission rules and regulations and the tariffs and all that, because things were regulated. And as Wendell pointed out, all that went out the window in the late 70s, and nothing was regulated. And they went to a free market system, basically, where companies could quote whatever they could quote or wanted to quote to try to get the business. It went from, one extreme to the other. And so that was a major change to the river business.
Well, we towed a lot of empties northbound.
Yeah, we did.
As a result.
Yeah. Something else I wanted to bring up was you guys remember the call sessions at the Merchants Exchange?
Right.
There was a call session Monday through Friday. It was a grain call session at the Merchants Exchange. And Zach, I don't know if you know, the Merchants Exchange was on Oakland Avenue, right by where the old arena was, if you know.
The Checker Dome.
The Checker Dome, yeah. It was a Merchants Exchange.
It's now part of the Science Center.
Yeah, right. There were a lot of grain companies that were headquartered in there, like Consolidated Grain and Barge, Continental Grain was in there, Cargill had an office, Pillsbury. But
Dreyfus, I think, also.
Who was it?
Dreyfus.
Yeah.
Yep. Hillary Dreyfus.
But they called it a call session every Monday through Friday in the morning, and the barge lines and grain companies would all be in there, and they would quote barge freight rates on grain only, basically, for southbound grain going to the Gulf. And that went on. That was like the determining factor for what rates were going to be is what's traded that day in the call session. That was huge. But what happened was in the, mid to late 80s, some of the big grain companies like ADM and Cargill and some of the other, Dreyfus, they decided that they didn't want to show their hand necessarily each day to everybody in the river business by putting offers out there. They didn't want to expose their hands. So they pulled out. They said, we're not going to do this anymore. So they quit doing it. And at that point, the call session collapsed. They just didn't have it anymore. But the call session every day was huge. I mean, every grain trader and barge freight trader for grain every barge company was called into that call session every day. You call in by phone, you could be there in person, but you'd call in by phone and you can make quotes and offers and make trades right over the phone. But everybody would hear what you quoted and offered. It was a huge deal, but it all collapsed.
There's one other thing. It's strictly remembrance on my part in that Steve and Wendell and I were never of a sufficient caliber responsibility to have a towboat named after us. Okay. But it's interesting, and I guess it's in the Inland River Record. I haven't seen one in some years now, but it's interesting that all of the names that were famous for us on towboats at either Valley Line or Federal Barge or other companies, all of those names are basically gone. Once those individuals passed away and faded in river industry memory, those boats have all been renamed.
Right.
And you can't find a Bob Kyle or a Dave Carlton or a Bob Labden or J.S. McDermott or Captain Bogalusa Kapliner.
Right.
Captain Kapliner, his first name was Bogalusa. and he was a throwback. He was a throwback to the 1940s and 50s when we met him. His favorite thing was every Friday afternoon when most of the dispatchers were trying to get everything written up and responsibility, he would take a steel bar and throw it out the door of his office so that it bounced on the floor about 10 times to wake everybody up. He thought that was really cool, but he was a throwback. And there were a lot of them.
Everybody was afraid of Captain Caplear, you know. Then after he retired, they brought in Dave Carlton, and things just worked so much smoother under Dave. He had an easygoing personality, and Dave was a former river captain, but Dave had a very good relationship with all the unions, and that was important to Federal, because the Federal boats, as you mentioned, Mark, the Federal boats were all union, and Federal also owned United Barge Company, which you also mentioned, Mark. United boats were non-union, and so we could never have a Federal boat turn or exchange tows with the United boat, because first of all, the crews would not do it. They would not communicate with each other to exchange tows. So we can never turn those boats together. But still, the relationship was good. We just couldn't exchange tows with a Federal and United boat. But those guys would talk to each other on the radio. They got along fine, but to try to mix the two on certain events on the river, they just wouldn't do it.
Right.
Another nothing well known, but I remember very distinctly the St. Louis Shipbuilding Federal Barge Line office was at the foot of East Marceau Street, which ended right into Mississippi. And there was that's where St. Louis Shipbuilding was at. And then Steve and I and Wendell have been through some major floods over the years, but there was a major flood in 1973. And I remember very distinctly the radio going off in the office, sirens going off, when one of the dry docks with a boat on it broke away at St. Louis Shipyard and started floating down the Mississippi River with individuals on it, and the amount of response to come and get that, because I wasn't in St. Louis, but the 1993 flood was the next major one that inundated what we call it then, Gumbo Flats, which now it's Chesterfield Valley. And then there was another major flood in 2011 when I was in Paducah, and I remember sandbagging. On a Monday morning, we came in and Jeff and Ronnie and James said, turn everything off. We're going outside and start sandbagging the office, because the water was just about overflowing the Kentucky Dam. And there was a huge issue with that. And that's the year then when you got down to Cairo and turned down the Mississippi River, the Corps of Engineers took the opportunity on the Missouri side to dynamite the levee so that the water would flow into Missouri farmland and take the pressure off Kentucky Dam. That's some interesting things too.
That 1973 flood, I was still in Chicago at the time, and Federal had just launched their brand new boat, the Herman Pot, a 5,600 horsepower boat. The Herman Pot made his maiden voyage from St. Louis up to Joliet, and then had to tie off. They couldn't turn around and go back south because the river was closed. And that boat sat up at Joliet for 2 weeks after his maiden voyage before they could turn around and go southbound again because of the high water.
Wow.
I'll never forget that.
That is something, operationally speaking, because the three of us have done it all along, is that low water, high water, lock delay, no lock delay, because I remember low water in 1988. I was at SCNO, and we were building 9 or 12 barge tows at Mr. Cole Landing. And those barges had to be 7 feet or less. And the Coast Guard would get on your boat at Cairo and look at the draft on the towboats, because Memphis was at, I don't know, -8, -10, -12 feet, something like that. So we've seen floods, and we've seen a whole lot of low water issues too.
Yeah. You still see that today, issues with high and low water. Kind of leads me to my next question is, through the ups and downs in the industry, the changes, it's always been a industry of collaboration, and it's always pounded through. You guys have always kind of been there for each other. But if you can speak to some people in your career or in industry in general that have had like a positive or a big impact on your careers and the overall industry.
Go ahead, guys. I go back to Bob Kyle at Federal Barge all those years ago.
Yeah.
But when I was at SCNO, there were two men there, a close friend, Jeff Kavinsky, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but Jeff Kavinsky was a VP there and just a great guy to work for. And the president of SCNO, because in 1988, SCNO was sold to ACBL. And I remember this day, the president then, Joe Bobzine, came over from Jeffersonville to St. Louis and into the SCNO office and said, anyone that wants a job with ACBL can have one, which I was very surprised to hear. And there were 8 St. Louis families that took advantage of that and relocated to Louisville, Jeffersonville. So I'd have to say at that time, Joe Bobzine and then the man that followed him, Mike Hagan, were 2 stalwarts of the inland waterways industry. And there's a few names for me that stand out over the years.
Yeah, well, for me, it's likewise Bob Kyle. He's the one that moved us from Chicago to St. Louis. And then there's 2 more that are pivotal in my career. Dan Markowitz, who has hired me 3 times. He hired me at ConAgra and at Merchants. And then he hired me again at Valley Line. And so he's had a huge impact on my career. And the last one is Chris Parsonage with Memco. I can honestly say that Memco, which turned into AEP River Operations, was the best company I ever worked for. And so I'll always be grateful to all 3 of those guys. But, the last one, Chris Parsonage, he had Wendell call me and offer me the job. And that was huge for me. So those are the 3 people for me that were pivotal in my career.
Yeah, I'd have to go back to when I first started there in Chicago. I was fresh out of high school. I didn't know anything about business, how to act, or how the business itself. And the 3 people I worked with there in Chicago, Dave Abusi, he was the Chicago sales manager. Tom Maloney, who was the Midwest regional sales manager, who then later transferred to St. Louis. And then the fellow that took his place, Jack Flau, those 3 guys really, I guess you could say, helped me grow up and grow into the business and understand how things really work. So I'd have to say those guys had the biggest impact on my overall career and just my overall life, really.
Yeah.
I have to footnote one thing too, because as we talk, there's so many names and situations, but Steve mentioned Dan Markowitz, and I cannot pass this by without mentioning Jim Farley. Jim and Dan, I arrived at ACBL from SCNO, and I had a responsibility to put the barges from SCNO into the ACBL system, then the barges from Valley Line into the ACBL system, and then the barges from Conti Carriers into the ACBL system. And that's when Mike Hagan was taking ACBL, but he had a personal commitment to get to 5,000 barges. And Dan Markowitz and Jim Farley were brought in on the operational side and did a major reorganization at ACBL in 1991. And Jim Farley became a mentor for me as I was director of the Ohio River. And I worked very well with him for quite a few years. Well, from 1990, 91 until I left in 1998. But Farley and Markowitz were great guys to work for.
Yeah.
That's great. Now you guys are, retired, but still, a part of the industry.
Not a very big part anymore.
Well, you played a huge part. For people, getting into the industry or just started out, what would be your biggest piece of advice for them? And it's kind of the first part of the question. And then secondly, how do you see the industry today compared to how it was and, the future outlook of it?
Well, I'll start out by saying one thing, because I was thinking about that after talking to Dave Murray yesterday, and there has to be a clear understanding that there's a distinct advantage in not thinking that you need to start at the top. You need to start at the bottom, and you have to learn how all of these pieces come together association with the Coast Guard and the Corps of Engineers, the fact that the towboat industry is 24/7, 365. It never stops. And you have to understand your family situation, your personal situation, and accept those responsibilities. And I just can't emphasize enough, because I think long term, it can be the career can be very rewarding. Of course, the three of us, we never appeared in the 40 and under group. We were 30 years past that. So we never got a chance to talk about that. But that would be my main thing. Talking strictly from the land side, not from the water side, but on the land side, is it's important to understand how the pieces come together at like the dispatch level or the insurance level, and then put that all together for a career.
Yeah, I would have to say to young guys coming on, or young people coming on now, get out on the boats, find out how the business really operates, learn, how the interactions with the towboat people that work on the boats, because they're the ones that make it happen. You can sit in an office somewhere and give orders left and right and sound really important and smart. But if it's not right out there on the river, it's not going to work. You need to learn the business from the ground up, as Mark was saying. And if you're, working in a fleet, get out on the towboats, haul some wires, haul a pump, learn how to shingle a barge. Get out and do those things so that you really understand what the business is all about. Because if there's one thing that's been constant through all of this, even though, when we first started and it was all single sideband communication or through marine operators, and now it's all done by computers directly by satellite linked to all the boats. The one thing that's constant is boats and barges still go up and down the river at the same pace as they always have. Right. The people out there, they still have to haul wires, and they still have to, make couplings and haul ratchets and
heat and cold.
And pardon me?
Heat and cold.
Yeah, in 100-degree heat or 10 below zero, they're out there doing that. So if you don't understand that part of the business, it's hard to sit there and tell people what to do. At least in my opinion, it's hard to tell somebody what to do when you have no idea of what they're really doing.
Yeah, right.
And so I would, for a young guy or gal coming into the business, get out there and ride the boats. See what these people do out there. Learn the language, learn what they're talking about when they talk about a brake coupling or an ice coupling or, steering coupling. Learn those terminologies so you understand when you're giving orders what that means to those people out there. So to me, that's the one thing the advice I would give, but again, like I say, because that's the one thing that stayed constant through all of this. I mean, AI is going to be the wave of the future. It's going to tell you which barges to pick up, which ones to drop. They can do all of that, but if you don't understand what's going on, you can't tell AI what you need or what you want to accomplish. And so that would be my advice.
Yeah, I think we all, the three of us all started in dispatching. I think that's a great place for any young person to start off in the river business. Because in dispatching, you're not only dispatching your river segment, like the Illinois River or the Upper Mississippi or whatever it is, you're also talking to the boats, you're talking to your customers. You are a focal point for a lot of different things. You're like the hub of a wheel. And you've got a lot going on. And you also have to collaborate with your other dispatchers in the other river areas, because what you do affects what they do. And so it's a great place to start to learn the business and learn how to get along with people and collaborate and talk to a whole bunch of different people, because you have to wear many hats in dispatching. And that's one thing that I know the three of us all found that out once we got into it. And, I would highly recommend, but there are other jobs in the river business too. There's, insurance people and that type thing. But I think just dispatching is a great place for anyone to start in the river business. But as Mark pointed out, it's not for the faint of heart. It's 365 days a year, 24/7, including weekends, and you get those calls in the middle of the night sometimes, and you just have to accept that as part of the job.
Part of the job. That's correct.
What else did you need, Zach?
Oh, well, we're kind of coming up on the end of our time here, but it's been a pleasure, talking with you guys, and hope we can do it again soon sometime, and bring Jeff along too for the next one.
Well, Zach, before we conclude, I'm going to put Steve on the spot, but he mentioned, or Wendell mentioned, single sideband, and we just can't tell you. We would run 2 radio reports a day, 6 a.m. and 3:30, was it?
Well, 7.
Yes.
Well,
That was 7 a.m.
and then
7 and 3:30, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's also
3:30.
10 a.m. Remember, follow up at 10 a.m. 7:30, 10, and 3:30.
And the thing is, you had to get a position. You had to get the fuel on board, the fuel used, the lube on board, the lube used. Then you had to get all the traffic. Okay.
All the crew train changes. Yeah.
A crew plane. And invariably, we're in this little cubicle with a single sideband radio in St. Louis, and then Otto Candies would come on from down in New Orleans and just blast us off the sideband. But the point is that Steve still, I don't know how he does it at his advanced age, he still recalls a number of the call numbers and so forth for the boats.
I do.
And it's complete blank for me. So maybe you could give us a send-off by doing a couple of boat calls, Steve.
Well, I don't know. It might be kind of boring, but I do remember a lot of the call signs for the boats because we set them so many times, 3 times a day. It just got into your subconscious somehow. But I remember Mark at SCNO. There was a guy named Smitty. Remember him who ran the radio schedule?
Yeah.
You remember him, Mark or Wendell? And
Yeah, I remember Smitty.
yeah, I never met Smitty, but he was like a legend on the sideband. We shared it like with all these other companies, and I could hear SCNO and Huffman Towing and Auto Candies and all these other companies on there. And but Smitty from SCNO would get on there, and he was like a disc jockey. I mean, he'd get on and go, "Hey, you're calling this, the Omaha." It was almost like fun to listen to him because he was like Johnny Fever on WKRP in Cincinnati. And then we had Tom Senshin at Federal. Remember Tom Senshin?
Oh, yeah.
SENECZYN.
Yeah, Tom. Our call letters at Federal were KBQ. And Tom Senshin, who was a real car, and he's unfortunately no longer with us, he'd get on there for the radio schedule and go, "Hey, this is KBQ coming to you from East Marceau Street." He was like a disc jockey also. And our boss at the time, a guy named Al Clemens, who was an older gentleman, who was really a good guy, he tolerated us young guys. He would just sit there and just shake his head like, "Can't believe I'm hearing this." But the sideband radio, that was a struggle. You'd walk out of that radio room sometimes after an hour of trying to get all the boat traffic, and you'd be worn out. You'd be dragging from it, trying to fight all those other people on the radio that would be interrupting you and walking all over you. You'd be absolutely worn out. And so, and sometimes I'd write down the traffic. I'm not even sure I wrote it down right. I'd write down what I thought they said. Maybe it was right, maybe it wasn't. We never knew.
Well, Zach, the 3 of us are mid-70s to late 70s. Wendell's our most recent retiree. Steve and I have been out for some years. And all we can say is, in many ways, for us and our families, because Wendell met his wife through
That's right.
his employment at Federal Barge Line.
Yeah.
Right. As you can tell, we've known each other a long time. We get along really well. I miss Jeff Kindle being here today. He would have had a lot to add about this, but from the New Orleans perspective. But we can only say that if you want a fairly rewarding career, there's a way to get to it. And we're not talking on the river, we're talking the land-based side right now, because the river is a very different animal in terms of careers. but it can be a good career.
Absolutely. And it's got longevity
Oh,
too.
yeah. Yeah,
Well,
there's always going
how
to be a
many
need
years-
for
what-
river transportation. I mean, you have your rail and your trucks, but river transportation is the most economical means of transportation, and it'll always be there. It's going to change over the years, but it's always going to be there. And I enjoy following. You've seen this. We work the waterways. Zach, have you seen that? I follow what they're
Doing a great
doing.
job of
There's this thing called Wemotes, started
women in marriage.
started by Casey Eckstein, I think, with women in marine operations. I follow them too. I follow this Rivermen and Riverboats. Do you follow that one?
I think there's a lot of groups that I do follow on Facebook, and they might have a presence there.
Yeah, it's called Rivermen and Riverboats. It's something started a few years ago. It's on Facebook. People post pictures and videos of boats going up and down the river, and I enjoy looking at that. People put little comments about where they are, what they have in tow, and I just enjoy that. People seem to enjoy it, so that's how I keep track of the river business. That and the Waterways Journal.
I have to
There you
say,
go.
just repeat, Steve got his first inland river position in 1972. He retired in 2016. Wendell got his first position in 1974 and made it all the way to 2024. And I got my first one in 72 and retired in 2015. So we had a lot of longevity. Yes, we moved around, but we had a lot of longevity.
Yeah, that's for sure. I remember working in Chicago and I started seeing the Waterways Journal, and I looked at all of them. And what I find interesting, Zach, is that the heading is the same that it's been for as long as I can remember. This heading and logo has never changed.
Well, I guess this was great talking with you guys.